Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, on today's episode, I have two incredibly cool guys called Corey and Marc, not from Slipknot, but from WatchGuard Technologies, who are going to share their origin story with me and also a few geeky adventures in the old days of tech. And man, I could listen to stories like that forever. And Corey and Marc are going to be speaking to the state of the security market and discuss 2021 security predictions, including prominent attacks and infosec trends, and just about anything else that WatchGuard's Threat Lab research team believes could emerge throughout this year. And hopefully we're also going to be looking at the key steps that organisations can take to improve their security posture. So predictably, we're also going to be covering the importance of multifactor authentication for every single company out there. And surely that is a message that must be sinking in right now. And on top of all that, we'll also focus on endpoint protection as many employees continue to work from home, but enough from me. Buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Seattle, where Corey and Marc are waiting to speak with us now. So a massive warm welcome to the show, guys. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure, Neil. Thanks for having us. My name's Corey Nachreiner, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer, or CTO, for WatchGuard Technologies. By the way, I'm sure your listeners sometimes think of CTOs as the head of engineering. I'm kind of more the CTO that's a head of security strategy, and my main passion is running something called WatchGuard Threat Labs, which is our kind of threat team that is always putting our thumb on the pulse of the underground. And that's the team Marc heads up, so I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Corey. And thanks, Neil, for having us on. I'm Marc Laliberte. And like Corey mentioned, I'm the manager of the WatchGuard Threat Lab. And our day-to-day job is honestly one of the coolest jobs in the whole dang company. We get to take a look at the threat intelligence we get from fireboxes deployed everywhere and security threats from third-party feeds as well, and kind of distill it down into a picture of what the threat landscape is, and then find cool ways to disseminate that to the rest of the industry and our customers. And then along the side, do our own active research into malware and IoT security and a whole bunch of other fun stuff to try and just make the world a little bit more secure.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to have you both on the podcast today. The work you're doing is incredibly cool. And for people that are listening and hearing about WatchGuard for the first time, you guys are global leaders in network security, endpoint security, secure Wi-Fi, multi-factor authentication, network intelligence products and services, all for mid-market businesses and distributed enterprises worldwide. But the question I've got to ask is, where did your passion for network security come from? What put you on this path? Because I feel there's got to be, well, at least one story, maybe two here, but I'll send it to you first, Corey.
Yeah. We call this the origin story. Whenever we have this on our podcast, we always ask them they're kind of like a superhero origin story. Yeah. Because I think everyone in cybersecurity kind of has one. So I'll try to keep it short so we can get the marks, which is interesting for sure. But, I'm old enough that I kind of started in computing right when home microcomputers were just starting to take off. So I've always been this kind of tech nerd that, to my dad's dismay, took apart a TV or a stereo to see how it worked. And one day he brought home a Trash 80. I'm sure in the UK you probably had Sinclairs and stuff like that, but You're probably familiar with the Radio Shack Trash 80, 8K computer booted into BASIC. At the time, I didn't even have a tape drive for it. So like my first introduction to a computer was a BASIC prompt where I kind of learned a bit about coding from just, you'd grab a little gaming magazine and there'd be 3 pages of code that you'd have to magically transcribe to your computer. And by the way, if you turned it off, if you didn't have that tape drive, you'd have to retype it the next day. So that got me into computers, and it just naturally grew from there. I started out with a 300 baud modem, dabbled in BBSs, where I did start to, as soon as you got in some of the underground BBSs, started to get familiar with FRAC, a 2600, some of the text documents that were circulating at the time. But I was more just a kind of general technology nerd then, taking apart, building my own computer. Instead of buying a car, I bought my own computer with a full height 5 2.25 hard drive that was only 10 megabytes back in the day. So kind of aging myself. But I think the time that security really hit is on this progression. Maybe in my more teenage, late high school, early college years, I started to get into IRC, which I'm sure a lot of us old folks remember, but, internet relay chat is not, Discord is probably where the kids hang out today. But internet relay chat was huge. It was eye-opening for us. We'd create a channel where we talked to each other around the world. And as you created a channel, if you know anything about IRC, the first person to create a channel is the op, the administrator of the channel. And in the day when we got a channel that was popular, we wanted to retain control. So we started putting on egg drop bots. These are just IRC bots that sit on your channel when you can't, to kind of retain control, to give administrative access to the people that join who you know, et cetera, et cetera. If you're an IRC nerd, you probably knew about that. But one day, our egg drop bot got hacked. I was the victim of a hack. Our channel got taken over, and I lost it. And it was very upsetting at the time as a kid, and I wanted to know how. And eventually I did hook up with the guy who was kind of at the time he was a nemesis, but later on a friend, who kind of introduced me to different ways you could hack egg drop bots, including actually DDoSing IRC servers so they would go offline so that you can join right away when they come back on. So that kind of started the path into understanding how computers could be misused, or how you could use them in unintentional ways. And that started a deep dive in my teen years and college years into everything from, back then I found the text document smashing the stack for fun and profit, learned a bit about buffer overflows, also was doing computer science at the time in college. So it was being hacked that got me interested in it. And once I got that deep dive and figured out all these novel ways you could get software to do things it wasn't exactly designed for, it just became a passion. It's a long-winded story, but that is my origin story.
I love that origin story. It takes me back as well. I too remember copying out pages and pages of code and then having to... I always seem to get it wrong though, and had to go... But it seems to take me even longer getting through all the syntax errors afterwards, but that was another story.
It's a start to debugging, right? I mean, you'd mistype one semicolon somewhere, and it would take hours more to find that than it did to type. And to me, that was kind of an introduction of what some of my debugging days would be like too. The same little typo mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh man, I still get cold sweats thinking about that. And you also hinted that Marc has got an intriguing origin story too. So Marc, you got a lot to live up to here. Over to you.
Yeah, well, unlike Corey, I grew up in the era of the Pentium 3 and Pentium 4, so a little bit later. But I still came from around a similar experience of my whole life. I grew up trying to rip apart electronics, see how they worked. Did a lot of hardware hacking with video game consoles, a lot of software hacking with trying to create my own map packs for different multiplayer games. And really that kind of translated into cybersecurity then of, okay, so if I can figure out how to get past this block in a game or crack this game, not for piracy, but for learning, and how to put my own maps into a game, like what other things can I do with these sorts of skills? And it really built up to where I'm at now of just still continuing my passions of trying to rip things apart, see how they work. But now with the end goal of trying to help make sure that they're a little more secure on the other end of it.
Incredibly cool. And here in 2021, Marc, I believe you've discovered, analysed, responsibly disclosed and reported on numerous security vulnerabilities in a wide variety of Internet of Things devices since joining the WatchGuard team back in 2012. But can you expand on that and some of the work that you've done there?
Yeah, that's really one of my passion projects. Like I've got this stack of random network connected, well, I want to say junk, but they I'm sure they have some uses, but stuff that I've just bought.
Inexpensive consumer gear that probably comes from China, right?
Yeah, exactly. Lots of no name, rebranded, same motherboard, different casing items that really anyone would buy off of Amazon, like stuff, I'm looking for a network connected camera, or I'm looking for I've got like a network connected egg carton, which is kind of interesting. But I love picking up that and then trying to figure out what vulnerabilities might be left to them, to pretty resounding success, because a lot of these devices are not developed with security in mind. Like the manufacturers just try and put out something that works and something that'll sell cheaply, and not something that they necessarily care is secure. Which means I've tended to find a lot of like web app vulnerabilities and the management interfaces for them, vulnerabilities that could allow the takeover of the device itself. There was one interesting one I found that was for a cloud video or a cloud reporting video camera that basically would have let me take over every single user's account and view their live and recorded video feeds. Like there's some pretty serious stuff and privacy considerations in some of these devices that a lot of people don't think of. And that's what I try and find, and then turn around and work with manufacturers to try and get them resolved.
Love that. And Corey, I believe you enjoy modding any technical gizmo you can get your hands on, and consider yourself an hacker in the old sense of the word. So can you tell me more about that passion of yours too?
Sure. And I think this is where me and Mark share a lot of passion. But first, let me start with hacker in the old sense of the word. Yeah. Hacker nowadays has kind of turned into a criminal cyber attacker. So I certainly don't mean that. In my day, while I think in the 90s and 2000s, there I had exploratory phases, the closest I ever came to not being pure white is gray. So I don't consider myself a criminal hacker at all. But a hacker, the people that love hacking, think of it as thinking outside the box, finding a novel way to exploit something in a way it wasn't designed. Mark sets up this great, what you call capture the flag contest with badge hardware, where when hackers go to DEF CON or Black Hat, they just love the challenge of a really tough and unusual puzzle. So when I say hacker in the old sense of the word, that's kind of what I'm thinking. And by the way, it's also hard to call yourself a hacker, because real hackers don't call themselves one. Someone else actually gives you that honor. But that said, the modding part is, I did start with taking apart things. I really like that. And Mark mentioned we're both kind of gamers. It's funny how kind of our technical gaming passion sometimes gets you into coding, sometimes gets you into, like for game cheats, sometimes you have to figure out how to use a disassembler to find a way to cheat in a game. And that really extends to hardware, because we forget hardware is built on firmware. So when the first kind of next generation consoles, the PlayStation and Xbox came out, they were actually among the most secure digital systems out there, in my opinion, because the console makers realized piracy is a real problem, and with even past consoles. I mean, back in the day, people used to pull ROMs from even cartridges. So they really created all kinds of cool things. Like they were one of the first to use security enclaves with secure boot. And I just kind of got a deep dive into that hardware and how you could find vulnerabilities in the software too. I followed a guy called Andrew Bunny Huang, who's well known as one of the first guys to find a major software firmware vulnerability. I think it was in the DVD drive of the Xbox, but then created a chip that you had to solder into the Xbox to actually, this is a software flaw, but because it's embedded in chips and hardware, you actually have to do some hardware modding to leverage it. So like Mark said, never really into piracy. It was pretty cool turning your Xbox into a Linux server or a media server for movies and stuff. But it really got into that kind of modding. And that's extended to pretty much any electrical device, any tech device I get. Today it's 3D printers. Rather than just buying them off the shelf, I kind of put them together through parts and then print parts to make the printer better. It's kind of a weird Frankenstein where it's building itself. So that's kind of the modding I like. And I think it's just kind of an extension of the same problem solving that all, cyber hackers, people that are interested in security vulnerabilities in software or how things work would be into.
And I love the fact that hackers never call themselves hackers. If only we could get influencers to follow that same rule, the world would be a much better place, wouldn't it?
Usually the ones that claim hacker tend to be the script kiddies, which, by the way, as Mark would tell you, as I've become more management and less his role, I've probably become a script kiddie and lost all my cred, right, Mark?
Yeah, Corey lost his street cred quite a long time ago.
I love that. And here in 2021, how do you see the state of the security market? And Corey, I'll throw that one to you first.
Wow, that's an interesting one. It's definitely, I mean, what I will say is it's big because cybersecurity, by the way, I used to go to Black Hat, and every time someone said cyber, I'd feel like taking a drink because we kind of laughed at it. But it has become the easiest way to talk about all the types of security that go with information security. But anyways, cybersecurity, the big difference in the industry is it's an everyday home topic nowadays. You know, when I started, it would be months before you heard of big things, and you would never hear it in kind of public mass media, the normal evening news. You would hear it only on the tech sites, the nerd sites where we would talk about it. Nowadays, not a week goes by where some sort of cybersecurity incident doesn't make the everyday public news. So it's a everyday topic where businesses are losing literally trillions of dollars. Nation states are hacking each other, doing some pretty serious campaigns, and big things are happening. So from a security industry standpoint, I mean, that's good and bad. I mean, obviously, business and interest in security is very high, and yet we hear of a lot of bad things happening. If I'd have to give you kind of a picture in time of the state of the security market, I think the big thing that has hit us recently is supply chain attacks, the SolarWinds incident. Because as you probably know, the one big well-known tech company having a major breach resulted in legitimate seeming software being distributed even to other security companies who sold security products who were then breached through that software. Mm-hmm. That's a big thing for the security industry. You know, there are some of these people that were affected. And by the way, this is a very hard attack to, you know, I'm not throwing stones. It's a hard type of attack to detect, this particular type of supply chain breach. But, you know, you're in a state where even the people doing the protecting can be affected by really sophisticated issues. So it's a challenging problem. I think, you know, you always talk about, is security winning or are the hackers winning? It goes back and forth. But this supply chain breach is something I think the entire industry needs to think about as far as new strategies to protect everyone. So I know that was a meandering question, but hopefully Mark will add to it.
I think like the good news is that like as everyone kind of sat and watched in horror as this SolarWinds breach unfolded and just the sheer mass of victims became known, like it was really a wake-up call to a lot of organizations that they need to really take security seriously now. And I think in 2021, that's basically where we're at. Like organizations are going to really start focusing on securing their environments and recognizing that, you know, they could be the next one.
I would add to what Mark said, because it made me think of this too, Neil, that I think we should realize society, including digital society, we're an ecosystem that relies on everyone. So let me give you an anecdote. You know, I'm a typical introvert. While I can be very excited in front of crowds and like to talk to people, I do need my alone time to refresh. But when the pandemic hit, if you're an introvert like me, you realize that, yeah, I need to be alone to refresh, but I sure miss society. And you realize all these little ways that we take for granted that we connect with each other every day. Well, that happens in the digital world too. We are an ecosystem. The internet is literally an ecosystem of us allowing each other to connect to each other. And what that means is we're kind of responsible for each other's security. I used to say this with botnets, right? You don't want to become infected by a botnet, not just because you don't want to protect yourself, because you want to protect yourself, but you don't want to be the resource that helps attackers get other people too. And botnets showed that, but I think the supply chain issue shows that too. It's not only in our own advantage to protect ourselves, but it's in society's advantage. And we all kind of have to do our part for everyone to succeed. Because if there's one weak link in that chain, and it could be someone else's link entirely, there might be some unintended or way we didn't realize that we are connected to that entity or organization as well. So I think it shows that security is kind of a team game.
And if I was to ask you both to gaze into your virtual crystal balls, are there any tech trends that you see right now? Or do you have any predictions for what is waiting for us on the horizon? And Corey, we'll send that to you first.
Sure. Well, first, it's a good time to mention that every year on our own podcast called the 443 Security Simplified, we share our annual security predictions. And before we do that, we're actually not the ones that just do security predictions and then forget about them at the end of the year. Before we do that, we always go over last year's security predictions too. And I think we're our own hardest graders. So while we have had years where we were maybe in the 70% correct, last year we struggled to, if you judge one way, it would be 50%, another way it's 43%. But in either case, you can find WatchGuard's 2021 predictions, both on by listening to the 443 podcast or on our blog, secplicity.org. But some of the predictions, there's quite a range. Some of the things we think are happening is one, malware attacks are going to transition to homes and endpoints. Obviously, the pandemic forced work to start commuting and working from home. But we think even when the pandemic lets up a bit with vaccines, this trend is not going to change. People will return to the office. Many people miss it a lot, but you're going to have this more hybrid work environment. So we suspect malware is really going to start focusing on home users. So technically, how would that be? Well, malware's always targeted home users too, and it's had worm capabilities to spread in the network. But one thing we might imagine happening is malware that once it infects a computer, starts looking for indicators of VPNs, virtual private network connectors. A lot of us home workers have that. And whether they leave indicators in the routing table or just the network device interface table, there's automated means where malware could not only see, oh, there's a VPN adapter here, a virtual VPN adapter, but there's this private network on the other side of it. Maybe my worm should concentrate on going from this home machine to whatever that private network is, which might be a business one. So long story short, we see a focus kind of more on endpoint security. Network, endpoint, and identity security all need to exist together. But I think if you were to shift your budget right now, you want to focus on making your endpoint suite more robust, because attackers are definitely targeting malware that direction.
And Mark, any thoughts from you on that topic?
Yeah, if we're going to look at individual classes of attacks, one thing that our team's been tracking is really increasing quite astronomically over the last few years are fileless malware attacks. So these are highly evasive threats that really never touch your hard drive at all. And they're starting to become the standard across the industry because they're really effective and they're not that difficult to carry out. There's toolkits out there like Cobalt Strike and Powersploit that make it really easy for attackers to use this style of threat. And it makes it even more difficult to detect malware infections on endpoints. Like, this is why you need strong endpoint protection that doesn't just scan your hard drive looking for signatures or heuristics, but is actively monitoring processes of other applications running to look for suspicious behavior. It's really where a zero trust environment boils down to.
Absolutely. And by the way, Neil, if your listeners have probably heard of this, but another way to talk about these attacks is living off the land attacks. Kind of same thing, just a different common name. But if you're interested, if you're out there listening, there's a site called LOLBAS, LOLBAS, that basically lists all the living off the land dual purpose binaries. So the way they do this fileless attack is they use tools that are common in our operating system. The most common example might be PowerShell. I think every Windows admin knows it's a very legit, very powerful tool that I would use very regularly as an administrator. But if I can get just one privileged credential in your Windows system, I can use PowerShell to entirely launch a fileless attack in Trojan on your computer that has a backdoor connection.
And another big topic that we see over and over again is multifactor authentication. So would you both agree, I presume, that it's critical for businesses now, isn't it?
I absolutely think so. And even more so now that we talked about the work from home and this hybrid remote workforce. When our digital identity is the key to all security. To me, it's kind of the cornerstone. Identity authentication is the cornerstone of security, because you can put up the endless security controls, network, endpoint, data, all of them. Really good, strong policy. Maybe you're doing everything right. You're following NIST recommendations. But if a bad guy simply gets one of your privileged user credentials, it's game over, right? Because your policy allows your users the things that you're denying everything else. So authentication is the cornerstone of any security, because it really starts with what is this user allowed to do in my environment. And that's even more so when we started working from home, because we had this kind of passive authentication of, if we come into the office, if I see someone in Corey's office on his computer and I can see that it's Corey, it's kind of an informal form, a token of authentication, right? Yeah. But if I'm at home, that digital validation is all I have. The only thing I have to authenticate a company, to authenticate Marc to my company, is some digital form of authentication. I think your listeners know why passwords, while passwords can be used properly, they're still never going to be perfect. They're still always going to be able to be stolen or lost or guessed. Digital certificates, they're technically very strong, but a certificate can be stolen just like a password has. We've seen that happen in a lot of these big supply chain attacks. Then you have something like biometrics. The worry I have for the industry is the world realized passwords are insufficient, so they're trying to move to biometrics. Windows has Hello. All iOS devices have fingerprint or Face ID readers. But the problem is that's just another single token that can be cracked, just like a password can. I can steal biometrics in various ways. People have stolen fingerprints forever. Faces are even easier because people post pictures on social media. You think, oh, wait, there's this one that actually gets a 3D depth model of your face. Well, guess what? Photogrammetry can take 5 pictures and turn it into a 3D model. There are ways around biometrics that are the same issues passwords had, the same issues digital certificates can have. So the only way to get a strong digital validation of an entity right now is by putting some of those tokens together. I don't care what tokens you use. I don't care if you decide to use digital certificates and biometrics so that there's no password involved. If that makes it easier for you, that's cool. But you have to use some multiple factors of these tokens in order to make sure that person really is who they say they are. And it's not just someone using a stolen single-purpose token.
Excellent. And a question I always ask every guest that comes on this podcast is, especially if they're an expert in their area, is, are there any myths or misconceptions that possibly frustrate you every single day, that you must read all those Forbes articles, etc., and think, oh no, not another one perpetuating that myth? But I'm curious, are there any network security myths or misconceptions that you would like to finally lay to rest today?
Hey, Marc, why don't I talked a lot? I have one, but let me let Marc start with his.
Cool.
No, there's none at all. I think the biggest one that I always see is that people think that, there's one thing they can do, one service they can install, one product they can buy, and it'll make them unhackable. And that's just
a silver bullet.
True.
Yeah. There's no such thing as unhackable. Just look at FireEye. Like, they're one of the biggest cybersecurity firms in the world. They're responsible for coming in and investigating high-profile breaches. Like, they understand how to defend against a breach, and they were still hacked. And it's not necessarily their fault. Like, it was a supply chain attack. Like, it happens. And so it just proves the need for both stronger security, but also stronger detection and response capabilities for organizations too. Because there is nothing you can do that will make you 100% unhackable. You just need to set yourself up to protect against everything you can and then quickly respond to the things that you can't. And like, it's easy to look down on companies like SolarWinds because they've had a really high profile breach. But again, it really could happen to anyone.
Totally agree. And I'll give you mine, Neil. First, I'm going to start with a very contrarian one, just because if you ask everyone, we all probably have very similar answers. So before I get to my similar one of my favorite myths is that there's no value in obscurity. You might hear a security term all the time that experts, like even I have said in the past, that there is no security by obscurity, right? And our point there is, if you're just making something harder to find, you're just obscuring it in some way, you're not actually defending it. And so our warning is, you actually do need really strong technical defenses that do something to prevent the problem too. That said, I think we use the security by obscurity problem so much that we forget there is value in obscurity. As long as it's not what you're relying on, it's just a layer that you add to other defenses you have, obscurity is still a roadblock that could affect hackers. Right? I mean, if you think about deception technologies that are trying to trick hackers into, hey, hacker, you broke in, my real data's over here, come and get it. That's really obscurity. Your data can be found, your real data, not that deception device. And yet there's value in it. If you get the hacker to work on that side before they find the real stuff, that gives you a chance to maybe fight them off or prevent them from exfiltrating. So I do think we sometimes say there's no security by obscurity and forget there's actually value to that. My more kind of businessy and non-contrarian one might also be, we serve small to medium businesses in the mid-market, and so many companies just think, I'm not a target. What do I have that a hacker wants? And our answer is there's always something. It could just be the resource of your computer for a botnet, but it could be, you might be a fuss shop that's selling soup to 1,000 customers, but you have swiped 1,000 credit cards, which in the US, by the way, is still a little dangerous because we don't have chip and pin EMV yet, only chip and signature. And we still use the magnetic stripe sometimes. We're kind of backwards here in the United States. But the point is, even the tiniest business has value to attackers. We've seen that over and over. In fact, the SMB is often the low-hanging fruit target that gets bad guys into bigger victims as well. So no matter who you are on the internet, you can be targeted by these attacks.
And I'm conscious we've talked a lot of risks and potential breaches, etc. out there. But to end on a positive note, is there anything that makes you more hopeful and excited about the road ahead?
Yes, I think the answer is yes. I wanted to leave a foreboding pause there, but yeah, technology is always catching up. I mean, some of while they're buzzworthy too, sometimes we hear about technology like machine learning and we go too far talking about AI. But the truth is, while machine learning is still being leveraged in very basic fashions, that type of automation is going to make our life easier and bad guys' lives harder. Now, granted, sometimes the bad guys use those technologies too, but there's a lot of exciting kind of discoveries and new technologies that can be used in positive fashion in security. And ultimately, I'm kind of an optimist. I think the good guys will always win out against the bad guys. So I think it's kind of an exciting in general just to be fighting the good fight. Do you have thoughts, Mark?
Yeah. And really, I'm just excited that I think 2021 is finally going to be like the year of security. Like, I think our industry learned a lot from the major incidents in 2020. And organizations are realizing now that it's time to invest in your security. And just even outside companies, like even my parents have started asking more questions about how to keep themselves more secure online. Like, everyone is starting to realize that anyone can be affected by this and they need to step up, basically, which is good. Like, it's going to take a lot of work, but in the end, it will increase the overall security posture of basically the world and make the lives, like Corey said, of bad guys that much harder.
Yeah, Neil, and I think Mark actually gave you another myth there, the myth that IT is responsible for security. Yeah. And the truth is, I think we found and talking this through in the podcast, society, everyone is somewhat responsible. So to Mark's point, that awareness spreading to literally everyone, including our grandmas and parents, means everyone can become a little safer.
Couldn't agree more. And these are topics that I believe you discuss on a regular basis on your own podcast. So if anyone would like to carry on the conversation, find you guys online, check out your podcast. Can you just advise listeners where they can find you both online?
Yeah, sure. So if you want to find me, like, you can reach out to me on Twitter. My handle is XORRO_. My DMs are always open for questions. And like you said, we do have our own podcast. It's called The 443 Security Simplified, and it's on just about everywhere you can find a podcast. So definitely check it out. Put out weekly episodes that, I don't know, Corey and I have quite a bit of fun recording them. So hopefully you guys find value in them too. How about you, Corey?
Yeah, and I admit sometimes my social media posts are down a little now that I play the executive role too, but you can find me on Twitter at SecAdept, SecAdept. You can also, if you go to YouTube, it's been a while since I did what I called my daily videos, but I used to try to do like a short video every day on various security topics. So if you go search on YouTube or you go to our blog, secplicity.com, and that's SEC plicity.com. you can find that YouTube Daily Security Bite channel with some old stuff. So those are the places. Check us out at the blog. We love community, love talking to folks like Neil and everyone out there about security.
Well, I'll have those links to the blog post just so people can find you nice and easy. But love chatting with you. Got a great vibe about both of you. Love listening to your origin story, and also, of course, for exploring the state of the security market and just for discussing the 2021 security predictions, including prominent attacks and infosec trends. We covered a lot of information in a short amount of time. I'm going to be subscribing to your podcast. I hope everyone listening does too. But more than anything, just thanks for your time today, guys.
Yeah. Of course, Neil. It's always a pleasure.
A huge thank you to both Corey and Marc for joining me on the podcast today. I do love taking a trip down memory lane, talking about all those old days in tech, of IRC and typing out code from a magazine for hours at a time. But here in 2021, WatchGuard Technologies is a global leader in network security, endpoint security, secure Wi-Fi, MFA and network intelligence. I also believe that they're trusted by more than, 18,000 security resellers and service providers to protect more than 250,000 customers. But at the heart of all that is a mission just to make enterprise-grade security accessible to companies of all types and all sizes through simplicity. Wise words indeed. So for me, today's episode had just about everything. And I love how they started with their origin stories too. But let me know your experiences, thoughts, trips down tech memory lane, whatever it might be, by emailing me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. You get me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram at Neil C. Hughes. And my website is techblogwriter.co.uk. So I invite you to join me again tomorrow, where we'll do it all again, and then you'll find me sat waiting in your podcast feed once again. But until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.